Good afternoon, class. This is John. We'll get started with where we left off today. I was talking about, well, in the larger picture, we were talking about how the peripheries, meaning those parts of the world that were not direct beneficiaries and directly served by the second industrial revolution. We're talking this week in chapter 18 about how the peripheries respond um, and some of the frustration that they show. I guess it's not just the peripheries, there's also a lot of voices within the industrial nations themselves that were frustrated by the consequences and um, some of the problems that were caused by industrial capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So today I'm just going to skip through the things that we looked at in class. You had a couple objectives. You can stop and pause here if you need to. I tried to use the metaphor of how some people maybe feel about the Yankees to help people understand how the periphery, even perhaps to this day, how the periphery feels about the success enjoyed by the core of the industrial capitalist um, world today. And it had to be in class perhaps to understand um, those comments there. So taking stock, I wanted to sort of bring people up to speed as to what's happened. We're now, the second industrial revolution of the late 19th century has taken place, but as the events in chapter 18 will show, there's still quite a bit of frustration and unresolved feelings toward how the world is changing in response to this. And we talked about how there were unsettled and frustrated voices that were making themselves heard. We also talked about how this was a time of tremendous relocation and settlement. Let me just quickly see if I can share this. Will this expand at all? I don't want to share it. Anyway, this table that I didn't discuss very well in class today, those numbers are actually the percentage of population increase that is due to migration. So at the far left here, you can't see this because it's just off of the screen. This is the decade of 1900 to 1909. So what this column is saying is that 43.8% of the population increase in the United States for the first decade of the 20th century was the result of immigrants and immigration. So there you have it. And of course, that's a very large number, particularly for that decade. We talked about this in class. Map that shows sort of the general patterns of migration taking place during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then we started off talking about the experience of China. In some ways, China is our first case study. I could have talked about some of the challenges in Africa, like the Maji Revolt or the Anglo-Boer War, but I chose instead to focus on the Boxer Rebellion. And I built up a little bit of the context, a little bit of the recent experience in China in the mid-19th century. We talked earlier about Hong Xiuquan, who was an important prophetic sort of reformist voice. The Taiping Rebellion wasn't successful, but it did prompt the Chinese to think a little bit about what it might need to do to remain relevant and viable in a world that was changing very quickly around it. And so the self-strengthening movement, with its emphasis of East for essence, West for practical use, this was sort of where China was in the final decades of the 1800s. And sadly for China, at the end, I'm sorry, this is a little messed up. In the final decade, the Sino-Japanese War came along, and in this, Japan seized control of Korea, which up until that time had been a Chinese tributary state. It had been essentially a client state of the once great China. And so the Sino-Japanese War, among other things, was sort of proof that the self-strengthening movement was not enough to satisfy um, the difficult circumstances that China found itself in. And so after the Sino-Japanese War, there were some efforts, some dramatic efforts to try to change China and to take more than just the lukewarm, self-strengthening response. The emperor at that time, Emperor Guangxu, uh, fell under the sort of influence of a dramatic and sort of radical reformer voice, official by the name of Kang Yue, and Emperor Guangxu was willing to very aggressively approach this issue of reform, and he put forth what became known as the 100 Days of Reform. But these were reforms to the schools, to the military, to patent laws, medicine, Western trade relations, so on and so forth. Almost everything was on the table, and this was great. There were other um, edicts and laws put forth that singled out corruption. And whenever you have dramatic change, you're going to have a dramatic backlash from the people who are in power and who are benefiting from the status quo, the present way of things. And so this turned out to be true. So Empress Dowager Cixi, who was the aunt of Emperor Guangxu, sort of came to power and asserted herself with the help of the military and many conservative Chinese to take power from her nephew. He was going to be imprisoned, but he and Kang both were able to escape. They went into exile in Japan. Anyway, this ended probably the last best chance for China to undergo dramatic reform. And the years that followed did not show a positive turn of events for China. This will now be the time when foreign countries, Russia had already helped herself to a northern portion of China. France had helped itself to the southeastern portion called Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam. Britain had already sort of penetrated in the form of the Opium Wars and taking certain treaty ports and so on and so forth. And so the European threat actually will become even greater. We call this spheres of influence. The Europeans start to occupy various regions of the Chinese mainland. And the Qing Emperor, the Dowager Cixi, is helpless to do anything about it. So what happens? The Qing, under the Empress Dowager, are helpless to do anything about it. So the people themselves step up, and in 1900, the Boxer Uprising was a social movement undertaken by Chinese peasants. The name comes from the martial arts or Tai Chi that the followers of this movement practiced. Looked to Europeans like these people were boxing as they were training for their movement and their military exercises. Anyway, the Boxers will take over some of these European settlements on the Chinese mainland, and their hope is that they will be able to turn back the tide of European influence and encroachment. And for a short period of time, this appears to work, but ultimately, an international coalition military force will put down the Boxer Uprising. And what's interesting is the Dowager Cixi, she at first sort of supported the Boxers, mostly because she was helpless to do anything about it. They were much more in charge of China than she seemed capable. She wasn't happy that they were taking matters into their own hands, but she sort of played this middle of the road, well, at least someone standing up for China, so to speak. So she stood with them, but then when it was clear that they weren't going to win, she turned her back on them. And now China will only have another decade or so before it has its modern nationalist revolution. This map here shows you the spheres of influence of various European countries in China. It shows you how dire circumstances had become in China by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And as a result, the collapse of the old order is upon us, and the Dowager, she's still in power, although she's very weak. She does pursue a lukewarm attempt to reform education. She opens a commission to study possible changes to Chinese government, the degree to which it might incorporate assemblies that would help make decisions. Uh, the problem is the situation is very dire, but the pace of change, even the timeline under which these modifications are undertaken, is very slow. And the new elections for National Assembly are not ultimately satisfying. People want more than just the small, modest changes put forth. And railroads are being built largely by European capital and European expertise. These railways are ironic in the sense that they're putting out of business and putting out of work some of the traditional sectors. China had a long-standing history of canal workers who essentially hauled ships up the canals using ropes that they attached to or held over their shoulders on land as they hauled. And so railways were a threat to that, but they were also a symbol of foreign capital, a symbol of foreign expertise, and they also operated for the benefit and commercial benefit of external interests. So railways themselves became sort of a sign of what was wrong. And as a result, rising rural unrest, and this is going to ultimately tip the balance. And the last the last dynasty in China, the Qing, will fall in 1911, and China will now begin a rocky, bumpy 20th century, but one that, as we know, has managed to turn around a lot of fairly important things and made China a more viable state in the modern world. So with that, I'll stop.